Okay, so good evening, everyone. So thank you very much for joining this FOSI online talk. This is Ricky from FOSI. Also have Pak Herman as our advisors. So this is our 31st FOSI talk. So every week since COVID-19, we have a new FOSI online talk, and we have posted it and in our FOSI YouTube channels. Yeah, so everyone should see it and subscribe. So first, we want to thanks to Noble Resource for sponsoring this FOSI Zoom platform since the beginnings. And then tonight we have Dr. Franz Kessler. Yeah, he is an expert of a regional geologist that has been working in many continents around the world. This is very interesting because we will discuss about the hydrocarbon retentions in West Borneo. So Franz Kessler and John Jong is our frequent contributor in Berita Sedimentology. Thank you very much for coming, and we are very proud of you. Yeah? So I hope you can enjoy this talk. And then before I hand over to the speakers, there are some rules about these meetings. The first one, you need to mute the audio and video during the presentations to maintain a good connections. And the second one, if you want to have a questions later on, just put your name in the chat box here. And we will record this session for YouTube. I think that is all from me. Now, without any further ado, please welcome our speaker, Dr. Franz Kessler. Your time, please.
Okay, good evening to you, and thanks for joining into the session. And as already said, it's a story by myself and Dr. Jong. So we worked for many years together on Sarawak and also Peninsular Malaysia, and we acquired data from reservoir seals and also in particular now in this session on oil columns. And why talking about oil columns? Because oil columns really is the one which drives our economics. So rather than talking about reservoir and seal, which we actually do here, but we will attack it from the point of view of oil columns or gas columns, I mean hydrocarbon columns. And from there we go to the different settings and then see what we can do in order to characterize different settings and also then quantify their respective potential. So I would like now to switch to the next slide. Next.
Yeah.
So our mission is we want to integrate data such that a petroleum setting can be understood. And before we go into more details in our quest for the oil columns, there are a number of parameters which we have to bring to the attention, and also there are constraints. And the first constraint is that we cannot, by seismic or other tools, we cannot really see anything which is on a subseismic scale, which subseismic in that means about maybe less than 20 meters or at the best maybe 10 meters. So whatever happens below 10 meters in the subsurface, we simply don't know what's going on. We can always make a model, but we are fooling ourselves quite a bit already. And then come permeability considerations. We will talk about that for a while. And then we also need to think about temperature and pressure regimes. And then comes also the next is the relevance of seismic amplitude support. I mean, that is in the last 20 years, that is a big thing, but sometimes it works. And I think sometimes it has been wrongly applied. And then one other chapter is then seal properties and continuity, both for reservoirs and for seals actually. And drive mechanism is very important. And last not least, also we want to talk a bit about fault seal and shale gouging. And of course, as we know, in any oil or gas accumulation, the length of the hydrocarbon column is mostly proportional to the oil or gas in place. Can go to the next one. Yeah. Here, of course, in a very simplistic way, typical structure is described. And So we have a structural spill point, and we have a top seal, a reservoir, and we can, using such model, to calculate a number of things, but one has to be very careful. The first thing here is that actually most hydrocarbon accumulations are less than the structural spill. I mean, the theoretical structural spill is not so often really realized. Most times it's a little bit less. And now go to the next slide. Yeah. Then again, when we go in the reservoir realm and we look at pores, we must always consider that we have, first, we may have cement between the individual grains, and then there is a kind of the triangular space in the middle here between the three grains. And we have then an area of clastics here, which is here hydrocarbon filled, but there's always a skin of water, which is surrounding that, actually that pore, that free pore. And very often the pores are also not connected to the next pore, which means that porosity is an indicator, yes, but what really counts is the permeability. And with that, we go to next. Yeah. And this here is extremely important. Normally, when we typically geologists, we not really think much about it, but actually we should, because we can see that the saturation height about the free water level is very, very different in respect to the porosity of the reservoir, and particularly even more so the permeability. So it means that if we have like a 20% porosity, it's 23 millidarcies, it would be a wonderful reservoir. And we will see that actually the practical oil-water contact is not much above the theoretical level. So we have this transition zone is very, very minute. We may have a couple of meters of transition zone, but actually above the transition zone, we will find good saturations in the reservoir, and we can produce. However, when we go from the red line to the blue line here, we have 8% porosity, we have 1 millidarcy, and there already the picture is completely different. We see that we need to go many, many feet above the theoretical oil-water contact before we get an acceptable saturation of hydrocarbons. This is, of course, an eye-opener when we think about very low relief closures. If we have a structure which has a very, very low relief, let's say 50, 60 meters, and then we say, yeah, wonderful, that could be a lot of oil and gas. But that depends then really very, very much about what kind of permeability do I find in this reservoir. If the permeability is on the red line, for instance, then yeah, I may be in business because of course I'm losing the transition zone, but I may still enough hydrocarbons below the seal in the attic, which may make it commercial. But if I'm in the situation of the blue line, or even worse, the green line, then there's only a sniff of hydrocarbons just below the seal. So that is already, I think, a good thought that one should take this into the picture. Let's take the next one, please. Yeah, here's another one. It's almost the same picture, actually. So we see again the saturation curves. And only, I mean, if we have huge structures with many hundreds of meters of reservoir, then if it's a poor reservoir, it wouldn't really be so bad. Even in oil, we can produce it still, probably. But if I'm in the poor man scenario, which is like black, it is a lot of actually waste the transition zone in there before we get to an area where we actually really can see producible hydrocarbons. So if we are in a 1 millidarcy reservoir, then we need to discount 95 feet above the free water level so that we come to a producible setting, which would mean that, yeah, if it's a high relief structure, then maybe I don't mind too much about it. But if it's a low relief structure, yeah, we could not do much about it. Next, please. Next. Next. Okay. So we can now already make one preliminary conclusion on traps is, of course, the length of the hydrocarbon column is economically important. And the high relief traps with the long column traps are economically much more robust in terms of hydrocarbon saturation. I mean, you have less problems in the production, and you feel more comfortable about actually the producible hydrocarbons. And then if we have the unlucky combination of low relief traps and low permeability reservoir, we are mostly in a situation that actually we cannot do it. That would at least be for the oil case. Gas is a lot less sensitive on that than oil is. And then we have another type of traps which unfortunately are not so uncommon, where we see that the permeability is upwards declining. So we see good reservoir at the oil-water contact or the gas-water contact. And then the more we go up into the attic, the more the reservoir is actually getting worse. And that is very, very bad news, because the good reservoirs in the water or in the transition zone, and into the discard, which is irreducible. Hello.
Very sorry, my connection. Okay. My connection is problem.
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay. Are we next to the slide there? Next slide there?
Yeah, the next, please. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah.
So we're coming now to the next entry chapter, so to say, which is about temperature and pressure. And of course, we know that temperature affects reservoir porosity and permeability by diagenesis. But it also says, of course, that because of temperature, it could mean that deep reservoirs may not be viable objectives. We must check that also sometimes, maybe with analogs or with studies, what kind of reservoir permeabilities and porosities we may expect at given times. That is, of course, these typical diagenesis studies which you do on cores and cuttings, and may actually show you where the threshold of different mineral changes starts. For quartz, for instance, is about 100 centigrades. And then on the other hand, when we have reservoirs cooler than 77 centigrades, often also quoted 80 or 82, we have not so much problem with the reservoirs, but we get problems with the oil, because the oil is going to be very often biodegraded. So we have a window actually between a certain temperature, as I would say, between 77 and maybe 120 centigrades, when we can actually think about good oil-bearing reservoirs. And then we come to the pressure, and pressure is, of course, an important role in the sense that it can, but not must, but it can preserve porosity and permeability. So according to the pressure scenario which you bring forward for a given area, a reservoir may be viable or may not be viable. We have that a lot in Sabah, and in some areas, the pressure is really the enabler for fields there. Can we go to the next? Next?
Yeah.
Okay. So here we have actually what I call a temperature slice through the basin. We are seeing here a portion of Sabah, and it's like I have sliced here through the basin at 10,000 feet, and then actually put the temperatures. And what we see, we have blue tones, we have yellow tones, and some in-between shadings also. And yellow is a very hot temperature gradient area, and blue is low temperature gradient area. And this is very important, because if we go to the yellow areas, which is a bit more inboard, and try to go for deep reservoirs, we have such a high heat flow there that in most likely we may not have viable reservoirs. Even if the hydrocarbons would be there, the reservoir would simply not work really. And then we have reservoirs which are perhaps deeper and further offshore in a cooler area. These blue areas, for instance, then in those blue areas, we come to that later, we have a bit of pressure, a bit of overpressures, and we have lower temperatures, which means that actually at very deep levels, we can find reservoirs which are still viable and well producing. Okay, next one. Yeah. And here I show you an example from a well in the Penyo Basin. It's the well Ara1, and that is another of those wells which offer surprises. And here we have an uneven heat flow, or better gradient. When we are in the surface, it's around 3.4 degrees, so that is just normal average. But when we come to a greater depth, for whatever reason, we don't really know exactly why that is, the temperature gradient jumps. And very quickly we get to high temperatures. So this well, I think, came to 180 centigrades at TD. I mean, that is already very difficult for logging actually. But in that hot cell, so to say, in the deeper part of the well, it's far too hot for good permeability. And that is shown very clearly in the rock analysis. You have seen at least 3 or 4 phase changes between minerals. I mean, the quartz has recrystallized 2 or 3 times, and the clays have recrystallized and so on. And when that happens, it's mostly not in your favor. There can be exceptions, but normally diagenesis means it gets worse. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Yeah. And this is another map which we made here in the Penyo Basin area on the border with Indonesia also. So we see here that the temperature gradient in a relatively small area is widely varying, and driven by geology. We're not quite sure what it does, but there is a very strong impact by settings like structure, tectonics, and the like. And some areas would, for instance, qualify for deeper reservoir objectives. You could drill these areas with the confidence that maybe your reservoir is not really so dramatically changed or altered. Whereas when you go in the yellow areas or in the orange areas, the gradient is high, and that means there's no need to drill deep, because if you drill deep, then you will find maybe oil, but no reservoir. So, and that means the oil may still be in the pores, but the spaces between the pores is already destroyed by growth of minerals. So there's actually 2 examples where wells were drilled, And what happens is everybody was excited because when they drilled, there was plenty of oil on the shaker and the bleeding course of oil and all that, which looks actually quite exciting, but that is just oil which is freed by the drill bit. When it drills, actually the oil which is in the remaining porosity, but it's not connected. We go to the next slide. Next. Yeah, there's here also, one can also play like this, define where the really the bad quartz overgrowth is. In this case, it's 130 centigrades, and that is the annihilation temperature, where actually the quartz transformation, the quartz growth is that strong that you can argue that there's no permeability left. So we have areas again which are pink and blue, where we can where we find maybe better conditions at depths, and the other areas, the yellow and the brown areas, are far from any hope, really. Next one. Yeah. And another important relationship is the relationship between reservoir temperature and oil gravity. So in that particular area, but actually in most areas, in most basins, it's around 80 centigrades, and it can vary a little bit. So in this case, we have here a scatter diagram of different oils from the Malay Basin here, and we see actually that most, if not all, the oils which are in less than 80 centigrades, or to be precise, at 75 centigrades, when they're left on the left line from the dashed red line, they're all actually biodegraded oils. That means the gravity is high from the oil, it's sticky oil, and that's of course not that what you really want to have. But yeah, very often it's better than nothing. But the good oil, also the high API gravity oil is a lot easier to produce and has a much higher value on the market. Okay, next one. Yeah, here we have also, we are in Sabah again, on the border with Brunei. We have again this time a slice, so the basin, but it is a pressure slice at 10,000 feet. And again, we in that particular area, maybe pressure is more important than temperature in some way, but actually it correlates also in this particular area. So low temperature and high pressure correlates with each other in some places. And the yellow areas, interestingly, they have high temperature, but the pressure can be very varying. And in some places, it's really, really extremely high, below a certain threshold. And in other areas, it's perhaps not so high. But again, there the problem is then the temperature. But here again, we see that one corner in the southwestern corner, which is the blue area, that is a very prolific area at the Brunei border here, where we have some big oil fields also. And when we move away from there, actually not much really works fine in the yellow or orange area. It doesn't really work well. So the reason being is that pressure, where we have high pressure, we have no good reservoir continuity. We not find vast continuous reservoir. Why is that so? If we would have continuous reservoir all over the place, then the pressure would deplete very quickly. And apparently this is not the case. So we have lenses of isolated reservoirs with isolated aquifers, and there's not much because the fluids are static. It means that also there's no dynamism of flow, and it means the temperature actually and the pressure remain more or less the same. So that is why porosity and permeability can be preserved. Next one. Yeah. And here is actually a very nice, beautiful data scatter. That is from a total study, I believe. And we see two gradients. There's a straight gradient and there's a curved gradient. And the straight gradient is the one which you would expect. It is mostly in water drive systems. And where we have the curved line, that is these typical deep water settings, which are high pressure and low temperature. And here we see that the porosity is much more gentle to us. It goes far, far down to the deep reservoirs. You can still find acceptable reservoir cases. One point down the orange, that is the extreme, that was the MLJ2 well, which even, I mean, not remember exactly, but it's far deeper than 10,000 feet. And you still had 12 or even 13% porosities. And permeability also is an issue there in these reservoirs. Surprisingly, the permeability is also preserved, not only the porosity. And that means particularly for gas, your cutoff can be below 1 millidarcy. In that area, even it's a half of a millidarcy, which is the cutoff for producible gas in that particular reservoir. So it's quite astonishing. Next one. Yeah. And again, when we go back to our Sabah shelf here, we have a kind of a model here, which is maybe far too simplistic, but maybe it gives a message. First, in the shallow area, we have a hydrostatic realm. And beneath the hydrostatic realm, we have different reservoir seal settings. And when we go to the east, where we have the red area, becoming very quickly from a hydrostatic area through, regional seals, yeah, into very hot and geopressured rock. And in this particular hot and geopressured rock, it's very, very difficult to operate. I wouldn't say impossible, but it is highly demanding. And anyhow, if there's anything, it would be gas. If you look for gas, maybe one can try to do something there, but it's highly, highly difficult. And then you go to the other side, where you actually have different layers which are onlapping to the shelf. And these layers are actually separated by each other by again, sealing shale members. We have in there, we have mild overpressures, and they're stepping down bit by bit, the pressure increases. And we never seem to get quite to the fracture gradient, at least in Sabah, I have not seen it happen. So that is the reason why at the particular extensive depths, we may still have workable reservoirs. Okay, next slide. Yeah. Okay, the last bit here is from this more theoretical part of our talk here is clay gouging. Yeah, next one. Next. Many structures in Malaysia, but also I believe in Indonesia, depend on clay gouging. And unfortunately, mostly we not see the faults. When we see them on seismic, then there are huge, enormous faults, and probably not only one, but 2 or 3 parallel fault systems, which then look as one on seismic, but actually tiny faults which we'll never see. And the problem is, if you see oil fields and they look wonderfully continuous, and you produce them for 10 or 20 years, the reservoir suddenly see, oh, there's a barrier, and here is a buffle. So in the virgin oil fields, there are already these buffles, they're already there, but because of good reservoir pressure, you not really see them on the production scale. But when you lower the pressure in the oil field, then suddenly you appear buffles in the system, which are faults which are invisible, but which then start to act and which make different segments. So here on the picture, this is a very nice fault. It's already a big fault. It's a 60-meter throw, and it's about 15 to 20 centimeter thickness. And again, the gouge is not clay only. It is a mix. You have everything you can imagine in there. Boudinage sand, and then another clay layer, and another thin sand, and another clay. If you would not really know that's a fault, and you would put your microscope directly on the gouge material, you would think, oh, it's a normal sediment. You have sand over shale and shale over sand, but no, it is pulled in and it has been transported and squeezed along the fault plane. And that means that it's not so easy actually to quantify what the sealant capacity of such a fault is. I mean, we have a mostly laminated texture in there, but in many places it seems to work surprisingly well, because you have this composite effect of multiple layers, even so they are very thin, but they are very nicely sealing. Okay, next please. Yeah. Then we also should quickly discuss where do we have clay gouging. I think we have it actually all over the place. It is normal faults, and it can be a reverse faults in here. Those faults here, of course, have only minor gouging, and there is a kind of an empirical relationship between the length of the fault, the width of the fault, and the width of the gouge material. I mean, it's a bit of a rule of, yeah, it's a simple rule, but actually it works out very nicely most times. Long faults have also more width and have more clay gouging than tiny ones. I mean, they're not really long faults which have only very, very thin clay gouging. No, it doesn't exist. Clay gouging also is as good or as promising in reverse faults or thrust than it is in normal faults. Next one. Yeah. And now here comes our work, which we did in Curtin University, and also John Chong. He was very, very helpful in bringing data together from Staba. And our suspicion is, we not only have the suspicion, but we did some field studies as well, and it seems that there is a correlation between clay gouging and actually the throw of the fault. So big faults have wider gouging zones, and also that means mostly more clay. Next one. Yeah. And now it becomes really, really interesting, because when we plot the length of oil columns against the shale gouging ratio, which is still probably one of the best parameters to use in the gouging world, then we see actually that whatever the ratio is, when we have moderate shale gouging ratio or high shale gouging ratio, then we seem to hold back the columns. So it's actually one of the not so common cases where we have a yes-no scenario. When we have a shale gouging ratio of 0.4 or better, then the columns are there. If we're less than that, a few lucky tiny ones, but not really that much to dream of. So this is a very important, actually, qualifying result from our study, where you can use to perhaps rank some of your prospects. Okay, next one. And here we're talking first about the shallow realm. We talk about reservoir and seals together. And here we start with the shallow realm. And now we are here in Miri, which some of you may know is, I think, a world-class location for studying rock. Unfortunately, not really appreciated as much as it should be. I mean, because people think planting some palm trees is more important, or to make a few housing projects. But I mean, there are really some wonderful world-class outcrops to see there. And again, I come on the previous statement, which said that most of the reservoir settings, in particular in the shallow realm, when we deal with deltaic reservoirs, deltaic seals, we not see anything. If we have an estimated seismic wiggle here, yeah, you have a zone maybe 50 meters or 20 meters of clay, and you can say, yeah, that is maybe a sealing sequence that is maybe correct, but when it comes to the individual sealing bodies, we are talking in miri here, we're talking about millimeters or centimeters. And surprisingly, these very thin clay layers, you can find them over kilometers. It is not what you would expect as a geologist, but that happens, so it can happen. So here we have a moderate quality reservoir with very many continuous tiny clay seals. And when we go then to the next slide, please. That is a section from the last, one of the last wells which were drilled in Miri. That is very interesting because what happened in Miri is that in the early days, in the 1920s, when the field was brought on its maximum stream, really on the plateau, the drilling technology and the logging technology was very primitive. So you drilled essentially a hole and then you make a DST. And when it flows, it's good. And when it doesn't flow, it's not good. But actually, what happened here is that the wells, they penetrated quite a number of different reservoirs, which are sealed between each other. But the pressure difference between the individual reservoir bodies is not big. So there is little pressure differential from one reservoir to the next. But in the old days, they had no clue that this was happening. So they commingled the whole thing and produced it. And then very quickly, the water was coming in. And the water always goes to the best permeable reservoir first. The nicest sands with the best permeability are the ones which water out very quickly. And the very poor ones, that take longer to deplete, but you have also transition issues in those poor reservoirs. And so of course, then after the plateau, what happened in Miri is that the production went down like a stone very quickly. Within a couple of months, it went down from 20,000 barrels a day to 10,000 to maybe 5,000. And in the end, then it was hanging on at the rate of 200 or 300 barrels per day. And that is partly, of course, because of the rock and partly because these wells were wrongly completed. Next one. And then, of course, there comes always a moment when we think we understand a lot, and then we drill something, and when we say, oh my God, things happen which we not think they could happen. But I mean, the reality is more large than our perception most times. And that is here the very uncanny adoncation discovery, where actually there are very thin faults which shouldn't actually not seal according to the books, but they do seal. And also we have multiple columns in there which are bounded by very moderate or even very tiny fault systems. And we don't really have a good answer for that, why that really happened there. I mean, if we bring that field one day on stream, perhaps, then we would have to do more studies to find out really what happened. Next one. Yeah, we had already something similar. When we go in that setting or in the shallow, we can have occasionally bodies like in miri, sand bodies, which are relatively continuous with clay sealing of it nicely over kilometers. But the more common case, it is what we see here, is that actually we have a reservoir which is not a good reservoir. It contains clay layers in there, and it contains channels. And then there are shaly packages which are maybe 80% shale, but even in there also you have reservoir bodies. So, and the whole thing comes and goes from left to right and from right to left. And this is, of course, not a very good scenario, because most of these things which define your setting is very discontinuous and is subseismic. We not see much of it in seismic terms. Okay, if you might continue, next one, please. And then, of course, again, now we talk again about another uncanny case, uncanny discovery, which is Turnbuckle gas on the Tangol Arch. It's a very, very funny one, because it is on a high zone. It extends, that Tangol Arch extends also to Indonesia there. And it's quite far away from any mature source rock. And we did studies there, and we tried to find out, yeah, okay, there's gas here in the Turnbuckle, and a very funny gas. It's a very dry gas, but it has affinities to oil. So how do we explain this? And then we said, well, it might maybe come from deep down in that arc. Maybe there's a Mesozoic system or Paleozoic system. But now the typing of the gas is again very clear, and it shows it has affinity to tertiary rock. So what came out is that actually that gas in Turnbuckle, where the arrow is, may stem from other fields nearby, which have depleted their gas and may have been actually migrated to the aquifer. But the truth is that the structure would have been probably never drilled if there would not have been this whopping amplitude anomaly. And that was being visible on 2D and later on 3D even better. And because of that, it was drilled. And one could also see the channel system in the reservoir. But actually, it's a play which may be a bit underestimated. There may be more of those kind of settings that we have, gas accumulations which come from the main part of the basin, but to the aquifers. Next one. Yeah, that is here the model for it. The reservoir setting here is in a channelized system. It goes down to the Malay Basin, and probably from the Sotong fields, it may have degassed, and then the gas went up dip over time and reached the Turnbuckle area, and actually filled Turnbuckle with dry gas, but which has a typical oil affinity. So, and then there are other things you can maybe bring in, that the aquifer degasses because up there the temperature gradient it's particularly high, so that may also have an impact. So, next slide, please. And there's also, in Turnbuckle is a very interesting also accumulation from another point of view. It is a generalized system, but it has about at least 3 good reservoir zones in this one amalgamated channel system. Some of the sands are radioactive, but most of the really good reservoir is not radioactive. And it's this yellow color here, which have fantastic reservoir properties. I mean, in the order of 1 Darcy, not millidarcy, 1 Darcy. And the porosity goes up to 25 degrees and more. So it's fantastic reservoir. It's very unconsolidated coarse sandstone. And then there are some more shaly intervals in there, but given its gas, it doesn't really seem to seal anything off. But very interesting is then the question, where is actually the seal for the hollow and how thick it is? And the answer is, it is probably only 1 meter or 2 of continuous clay. So as I put actually down 75 centimeters of seal. Nobody would ever expect this could happen, but it happens. So it's really, really on one end of the expectation curve. It is so much on the end of the expectation curve for seal that you would actually say, nah, that will never happen, that will never work, but actually it did. So it's about maybe close to 1 TCF of gas in that accumulation here. Next one. Yeah. So now we come really to the center of our talk here, which is the columns. So we see here a statistic from the Barham Delta, and we count all the shallow setting of the West Barham Delta fields. And what we see here is that because of the combination of reservoir and seal, and maybe also the relatively low relief of the structures, we see typical columns around only 15 or 20 meters. Yeah. And here comes, of course, again, the permeability question. If you have very good permeability sense in these structures, then you're in good business. But if your permeability is not that good, it is hard to develop it. So we see here that probably P1 also is around 145 meters of columns. This is really the end member. But even normal large columns, 80 meters, 70 meters, they're actually the exception. The rule is in the 10 or 50 meters. Now the next one. So summarizing the shallow reservoir seal setting, we see very often subseismic syn-bedded reservoir and seal. We have often, but not always, but very often we have more sand than clay. And that means that because of the seismic setting, the changes in lithology in the lateral sense, it is not a good ground for going with amplitude hunting. It can, but very often it does not work. But what is a very good resource is fieldwork, particularly in Malaysia, in Sarawak and Sabah, we have outcrops next to producing fields. And then why not go there and look at the reservoir which you drilled in the offshore, why not look at it in the onshore and see what the reservoir is like. Then when we talk about the performance, reservoir performance, it's often lower than we expected because the sand bodies have often these clay buffers, which may mean that the oil is actually impeded on its flows, and it doesn't really, we don't see that right in the beginning, but later in the field life, then it may show its ugly face. But on the other hand, we have often clay gouging, which is sometimes better than we expected. There was that one example from adoncation. And long columns are very rare, but there can be surprises. But the odds are that you won't find really long columns there. Next one. Next. So now we talk quickly. Next slide. We call this now the transition realm. This is typical for areas of Brunei, for Sabah, and there may be also a few in Sarawak, but it's mainly a Sabah and Brunei story. That we have accumulation of oil and gas in the outer shelf. It is still on the shelf, but it's right on the edge of the slope. So it means that sand not makes it in regular terms out there on the shelf. It seems to come in pulses, and I wouldn't call them turbidites, but they have strong resemblance to turbidites, and they make little lobes at the edge of the shelf. And we have an example here of the champion field. That's the more inner shelf gas fields and oil fields. And deeper down, where the shale becomes better, where the sealift becomes better, we have gas accumulation. That is the Paragon field beneath the champion field. So that is a complete different setting. There's a lot less sand, but the sand is more continuous. And the shale is more sticky and more better. And there's also, if there are some faults, it doesn't really seem to affect much the continuity. Okay, and let's look what the statistics are like in the next slide. Next. Yeah. So this is a section here through the Kinabalu field in Brunei. It's called Mahajalela. It's the same thing. So we see here actually a transition from outer shelf reservoirs at the bottom to inner shelf reservoirs higher up. And we note that higher up we see a lot more amplitudes, but again, the amplitudes are very difficult to quantify. I mean, the spots which are quite loud, but we were not able to make anything out of it. Where else, deeper down, we come in the realm where we have overpressures, which getting higher and higher and higher, but not quite to the fracture point. So we have also two settings. The upper part is completely hydrostatic. There's no overpressure. Deeper down, where we come to the more like isolated body realm, which is isolated sand pockets, but continuous and separated by shale, we have overpressured gas and condensates in lenticular shaped bodies down there. And again, this goes together with the support. The deeper part has no aquifer support, or if there's aquifer support, it is very restricted aquifer. It is like a fossil aquifer. And the pressure is relatively high, but manageable, and the temperature is relatively low. So it makes a very attractive, actually, gas condensate reservoirs. Whereas higher up, you have just the typical shelf reservoirs with low oil columns and with water drive. Next one. And in this particular transitional facies, where we don't really have the typical shallow marine reservoirs in seal, but we have actually good sealing capacity, and we have quite nicely correlatable reservoir bodies. In this transition realm, we get actually decent columns. I mean, there are cases of more than 200 meters. But again, the frequency for moderate columns is a lot higher. I mean, the end member is good, but the in between it's just average. And of course, there's some low columns as well. Next one. So when we go now summarizing the transition realm is that we going here from shallow marine to deeper marine reservoir and seal settings to the outer shelf. If we go to the sand-prone shallow reservoir seal pairs, we see that they contain mostly oil and have water drive. Deeper down in the structure, clay is dominant. Reservoirs are often formed by fine sand to silt and contain mostly gas and condensate. There's hardly any water drive. There's mostly low to moderate permeability reservoirs as sands and silts, but which are very nicely correlated. And again, no particular seismic amplitude signature. Good, next one. This we talk now about deep marine reservoir settings. This is mainly, again, a Sabah and Brunei story. Here we see that we have these turbidite fans, which are very proximal fans, and actually are related to large areas of the inner shelf, which were inverted at a given moment in time and produced a lot of sand in that area, which then went down at the shelf edge and made these nice, beautiful sand bodies. And there's a couple of them on top of each other, which have all a little bit variation of mineral content. But essentially, this is very proximal material. You can sometimes find wood in there and things like that, wood or amber and coal also. And they're not very nicely laminated in the sand area. I mean, some have lamination, some have not. Some areas are more chaotic, some are more laminated. And then, of course, we have the very nice deep marine shales, which, of course, form very good seals. Next slide. Yeah, this is a very crowded view graph. I will only pick a few little things from here. We have two sections here of core, and we see that there's some lamination in the sand, but there's also a high degree of, I would say, grain continuity in the sand bodies. And the mineralogy is varying a bit when we go to the different cores. Next one. Yeah. And now comes the seals. Seal is often the most ignored or bypassed important parameter in exploration. Very often exploration is, we have a sand there, or it's so thick, or the grain size is like this, the porosity is like that. And very often that where it stops. And but seal is enormously important. And we did some statistics in Sabah. And the question is actually, when actually is a seal starting to be a seal, and when does it stop to be a seal? Depending on temperature and temperature gradient, pressure, and those things. And this question is not trivial, because when you go, particularly in the deep marine realm, the most shallow layers of material that you find there, it is like yogurt. I mean, it is soft. You could, if you were down diving there, you could push your arm into the sand or the clay. It is very soft. There's no consolidation whatsoever. And if it's not consolidated, it cannot keep pressure. So unconsolidated materials cannot be seals. So again, we have done some statistics on it, and it shows that at about 1,000 feet below the seafloor, we start to see actually the first active seals. And they are not very strong, and they can only hold a little bit of column. And then only when we are about 2,000 or 3,000 feet below the mudline, there we see systems where the rock is consolidated enough to actually do a proper seal. And then again, where we go more deeper, we come into a realm where again diagenesis comes into the play, and where the minerals have changed composition, where they have dewatered and maybe recrystallized, and then it becomes more brittle, and then it can be yes, it can be no. So again, the seal is probably at best at around 4,000 feet below mudline. Okay, next one. Yeah, this is now these typical deep water rollover structures, which have a good, mostly good turbidite bodies in there, and the charge is quite young, quite recent. And we have seen that in the more shallow areas above, also maybe the structure is still there. There are no hydrocarbons because there's nothing to seal them. Next one. Yeah, another beautiful setting of Sabah with these rollovers, naked structures. And in the practical part, it has been a little bit more, maybe less optimistic than in the beginning when people said, oh, I have a structure here and I have another one there, because to spot and to find the right turbidite bodies is not trivial. Are they on the top or are they on the flank? Are they in the center? It is not so easy to say, and even the amplitude analysis can also be faulty, or maybe luring you in a wrong avenue in that sense. So only when good flat spots are seen, then yeah, that is a good indicator perhaps. Next one. Next. Okay. And here we go. The Sabah deep water is a beautiful case for actually studying the columns, and we see that there's actually a very beautiful linear spread over the column lengths. I mean, there are short ones also, but we can actually see that there's almost the entire field of possibilities is covered, and there are enormously long columns here. 400 feet is common. Even more than that, 500, 600, 700 feet is possible. And also very interesting is that, that it is a story which is relatively independent of oil and gas. I mean, some structures have oil, some have gas, some is a mix, but actually the seal is on top. And what we say here that the column is, of course, relatively driven by the structural relief. So you cannot expect a huge column if the structural relief is low, no. But it all works, regardless for oil and gas. So it's essentially the driver here is the presence of reservoir and the seal, which is very continuous and reliable here. Next one. Yeah. And here we have also a beautiful distribution chart. It is almost ideal, actually. It is a dreamlike distribution chart. And you'll see here the lengths of the different columns, and the P1 down there is I mean, yeah, is enormous. So we have a full catalog of oil columns and gas columns here. Okay, next one. So how can we characterize that setting with a few words? We have more clay than sand. We have both blocky reservoir and seal. The amplitude hunting can help in many cases. So that's the geophysicist who gets a promotion there, not the geologist. But very often what is the problem here is that we don't really have good local outcrop analogs, because the analogs are mostly in the shallow realm, and then, I mean, yeah, you can do guesswork, but it's difficult. So in a really driven to a large degree by geophysics here. And then, I mean, both top seals and fault seals work. So we have clay gouging and we have also good top seals. And last not least, long columns are very common in that setting. Next. Next. Okay, next. So when we think this and sleep a couple of days or nights on this and think what actually, how could we pair these things? I think there's a lot more correlation you can apply between very different parameters. And what then can be done is actually group them into failure patterns and success patterns. Look how they play together, and then and then get from there meaningful probabilities. I say meaningful because you just take one setting, you don't make any scenarios, and you just run it with the same crossover model. Of course, you get an expectation curve, but that expectation curve is going to be bullshit because there's no reality. One has to develop a scenario and then risk these scenarios accordingly. So we have, when we discuss failure patterns, would be where we have a deep marine clay seal and a shallow reservoir beneath the mudline, so less than 500 meters, plus an overpressure system. So that cannot work because the overpressure is too big and the seal won't hold because it's not there. Another failure would be poor consolidation and lithification of the top seal. So again, it cannot withstand the buoyancy pressure from the hydrocarbons in the reservoir beneath, and only columns in the order of several meters can be retained. So this is these tiny columns which we find sometimes in the deep water. Then we have a deep water claystone seal plus deep water reservoir oil plus hard overpressure. I never have seen this. I mean, in the literature, there's a few cases, but hard overpressures and oil don't go together. So if you think you have hard overpressures and oil, and it won't work probably. So I do not recall any significant cases really. The reason may be that you can only compress liquids over a short while. A short while maybe, I don't know what a short while is, but not in geological time. And for that, it's likely to be inflated and breaking the rock. Then another failure would be intertidal clay seal, intertidal reservoir, overpressure, and oil and gas. Here we have a setting where simply the setting is such that the overpressures cannot really be held back. Yeah, and then on the top we have highly variable reservoirs, both vertically and laterally. So not very prolific setting. Next one here. No, on the bottom still got one here. We have, so in the shelf area it's not easy to explore for that reason, unless we have reasons to believe that we have very continuous sand and reservoir bodies, which can happen. And I showed examples already, but it is not the rule, really. Okay, next, please. So now can we come to the success patterns? So when we do our volumetrics and we run then the volumetrics, we should choose the particular pattern to where it is actually applies and then risk it within the envelope of that particular scenario. So the success pattern would be deep water claystone seal, deep water turbidite reservoir plus gas plus overpressure. That works. In this scenario, there is little or no retention risk, both in relation to top seal, as long as the seals are sufficiently lithified to withstand the buoyancy pressure. Then another success one would deep water claystone seal, deep water turbidite reservoirs, plus oil plus hydrostatic. Because the drive is not so strong, also, I mean, a relatively weak seal can hold many 100 meters of oil easily. Yeah. So it's sometimes in this case, then the oil is preferentially retained while gas is removed via a regional aquifer, possibly leading to small gas accumulations in the updip directions. So what we are seeing in areas which are very young, like geologically young, like Sabah, is that there seems to a wave of hydrocarbons seems to move and permeate all that setting. And then over time, actually, we see the effect of the retention, that in the good seal areas, we retain the oil, and and in the poor seal areas, we bleed off actually the gas. So very often we go in the deeper areas, we see more gas than oil. And the gas depletes in the shallow realm. So that would be a typical champion field case. Huh? Then we have another success case that we have shallow marine clay, a good topside reservoir, it's hydrostatic and it has oil. That would be, for instance, the Miri field, or maybe adoncation also, which is not developed yet, where we have a setting where both reservoir and seal is relatively continuous, lateral continuous. But again, with the caveat that seals can be very thin and are not easily seen, even with modern logs. And then there's another one where we also essentially in subtidal settings, where we also have the thin and often bituminous clay sequences that can also potentially hold back significant oil and gas columns. But also there can be transitions to reservoir discontinuity, and then of course the hydrocarbons are in lenses. Next one. Next. So let's make a little summary, which perhaps even may answer some of your questions, which I've seen flashing up on the screen. We have, when we talk about contiguity of hydrocarbon reservoirs with isotropic reservoirs, then this isotropy and the characteristics, that is the enabling factor for development of longer hydrocarbon columns. So we need significant continuous reservoir bodies, and the reservoir should not be too discontinuous or with major differences. Contiguous topseal is a given in deep water sediments, but not so in the shallow marine environments, and very, very rarely in the intertidal to fluvial settings. And then we also must say that the overall sand to shale ratio is critical. Hydrocarbon columns tend to be longer in clay-prone environments. So because there we have a higher chance to have a sand to clay juxtaposition. And in that case, of course, our chance is better to retain the hydrocarbons. If we only depend on mixed sand clay or relatively thin shale gouging, we cannot hold that much pressure. On the other hand, if we have hydrocarbons column that tend to be short in the intertidal settings, given a discontinuity of reservoirs and topseal, then abundance of sand and a poor fold sealing is probably guaranteed. Yeah. Therefore, both the probability of success of volumes and the possibility of success of long columns is far higher in turbidite reservoirs and seal associations compared to shallow marine shelf settings. Next. Yeah, so actually we come back now to the end of that session. And what I try to show you is there's a lot of numbers of different points of view and aspects which you can bring together, and sometimes also to establish tentative correlations, which may give you a much more logic and a much more stringent or convincing picture of actually what you're looking for. And it can help you at the same also discard scenarios which are actually not that convincing or likely. There was a case in Shell in Sabah, for instance, where they came over and drilled many wells in a shallow setting, and then they came to the conclusion: if you have a probability of success which is less than 50 in an area which is all surrounded by wells, then your well is not going to work. Because that's how it is. If you have many failure cases and a good calibration nearby, and then if you make a new one, you drill another lead and that doesn't have a good probability of success, it will not work. So there's many things you can consider. I would put particularly emphasis also on geology, things like diagenesis and permeability analysis and the like. And don't forget the saturation height functions. This is all very important stuff and can help you to come to a realistic picture. And I would like to thank you so much for your patience with me in my bed talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. Very interesting. I'm sorry, I'm having a very bad connection here. Yeah. So I think the main point is very important to understand the depositional environment, yeah, because it's very important to understand our seal capacity and hydrocarbon length because it's all related, yeah. I think that is the most important lesson here. So we already have some people want to have raise questions. Do you want to?
Okay.
Okay. Can you if you want to have a question, just please turn on your mic because I'm worried about my connection here. So Pak Sigit Ari, can you turn on your mic so you can ask Franz directly, please? Pak Sigit Prabowo, Sigit Ari, sorry, yeah. Pak Sigit.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very good presentation. I have one question for you. Is there any circuit ratio range number in different type of faults like normal and then probably trough, reverse, and maybe strike fault in the probably in the worldwide case statistic like that? Thank you.
There was one slide I showed from Sabah, which is the critical shale gouging ratio is 0.4. So if the shale gouging ratio is higher than 0.4, you're in business, and if it's lower than 0.4, it's very, very shaky. Yeah. But your question is also, is there difference one with overthrust or vertical faults and overthrust and reverse faults? And the problem is that we're not having so many good calibration points for the reverse fault setting or the overthrust. But what the little thing which we have, what actually looks like that there's not much different, that actually shale gauge ratio will work as well for reverse faults as it will for normal faults. So it is more, I think the quality of the gouging, which is perhaps more important than the type of tectonics.
Okay, and then let me continue with the maybe some another discussion. I have read some publication that probably the type of shale, the ductility and probably brittleness is also probably some of them is also part of the capacity of the sealing effectiveness. More ductile is more sealing, and then more brittle is more leaking. What do you think about that? So,
okay, I think this is very well taken, and I think when we go in this discussion, there we need in first instance we must bring it, of course, temperature and brittleness, what we have discussed already. But there's a very important aspect is also the clay mineralogy here. And in the Indonesia to Philippine area and Borneo in between and Peninsular Malaysia also, in the whole South China Sea area, we have a lot of volcanoclastic materials in the ocean, particularly in the deep water. I mean, a lot of volcanic ash, which is then becoming smectite and these kind of things. And it looks like in this area where we have a strong volcanic imprint, we tend to have better clay gouging and also a retention than in other areas. Like some empirical studies, I think with people from the Gulf of Mexico, they came to the conclusion that you have twice longer columns here in the South China Sea than in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, in comparison, and that because of the clay gouging actually, and the clay mineralogy in particular. So there is an important impact indeed there. So coming from, of course, the textural elements like the brittleness, but also from the mineralogy.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pak. Next question is from, sorry, let me check. From Pak Wibi. Pak Wibi, you can turn on your mic, please.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. Greeting from Norway. I'm sitting in Norway. I'm Indonesian sitting in Norway here. It's 2 p.m. Today, right now.
Okay.
I have two questions, Franz. But before I ask the questions, thank you for the brief. But it's quite thorough presentation in such a short time with many examples, and I like the way you classified the subject into different depositional settings. I think it's very interesting. So my question is quite practical. The first one is, how do you quantify an oil column with an only 20-30 meter of side seal? I'm talking about side seal here, not top seal. The seal is a mature source rock and quite deep, let's say 3,500 meters. And the reservoir is stratigraphically trapped, say, apron fans, and assume permeability and other geological factors support a good size of oil column. So that's the first question. The second question is, you showed one slide about a discovery called, if I'm not mistaken, adoncation.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and it's penetrated by one well, but I'm just wondering, this is out of the curiosity, do the other fault blocks in adoncation get drilled and found hydrocarbon? Because it seems like it's a very similar setting, small throw, but also contain continuous sands. So I was just wondering if the other blocks get drilled as well.
Let me reply to your second question first. It's like a 2A. Let's call it 2A. Adoncation is a little bit a weird structure, and it is a combination of there's a very important strike-slip fault, which controls the whole area. It is a fault which is about, at least you can follow him for 120 kilometers. And there happened to be a strong inversion and strike-slip movements along that fault. And adoncation is one block which is next to that strike-slip system. And of course, there are fault segments which are running against in that big fault. And adoncation is one of those blocks, and which has been found oil, gas, condensate bearing on multiple levels. And it's not the only block. There are other blocks also along that system which are actually prolific. There's the Saria field in Brunei, which is a big field. I think it's a billion barrels of oil, but it's very shallow. So in that area, somehow we didn't have the good sealing, which would have maybe prevented of too much hydrocarbons to escape. And then there's the Miri field again on that fault, and there's another one which is called, what was it again? Asampaya. So actually along that fault system, you have little segments, and they're partly inverted and contorted in some funny way. I mean, it's not really normal faulting in any way. So the faults are all curved. Every fault is curved, whatever that means, but that is how it is. And in that setting, we have some blocks which are dry and some blocks which have the hydrocarbons. So that was one of your questions. And then you said, what was the other one?
The other one is how do you quantify an oil column with an only 20 to 30 meter side seal, and the seal is a mature source rock, and the reservoir is stratigraphically trapped. Let's say it's an apron fan, and let's assume other geological factors support a good size of oil column.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first thing what I would say is that, of course, a mature source rock would probably be a very good seal, both as top seal and even as clay gauge seal would be a tremendous, perfect seal. Then on the trap itself, you're saying it is a stratigraphic trap. It means that you can only make it work out in a relatively low pressure scenario. I mean, if it's aquifer supported, it would probably work, but stratigraphically sealed, not so much from the quality of the seal, but from that wedge effect, you can easily get inflation pressures in the apex. And from there, it can actually blow the seal. So what I'm saying is, if you have an aquifer, and the column is not too long, then yeah, you may be in business, really. And of course, you need to check the reservoir and see how high it is and how much transition zone you may have to discount if it's water drive, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Franz.
Yeah, okay, thank you also.
Next question from Pak Didin. Yeah. Pak Didin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, can hear very well.
All right, I'm Didin. It happened that same like Pak Wibi before. I'm in Norway, Indonesian in Norway.
Okay.
All right. So it's very interesting topic. The keywords is retention. It's basically the case that I'm working on right now. I try to figure out the mechanism of hydrocarbon retention. And I just want to ask if you have an experience in a segmented trap where you have a different contact between the segment. And then you understand that the fault between the segment is sealing, but you need to explain the transmissibility of a hydrocarbon from one block to the other block, which imply that sometimes the fault is open to transmit the hydrocarbon, and then at the end it should be sealed to trap the hydrocarbon. Okay, only that one.
Okay, now that is, of course, it is a tough one, because not only it is in a static sense a tough one, but in a dynamics one is really where it is not more tougher than, yeah. It is possible that you have inside the reservoir buffers or actually segments which in the virgin state of the field are there, and then you can deal with it and print your boundaries, your borders, and come up with a pressure model. But as in the dynamic sense, it's more and more difficult, because when you lower the pressure in one block, you may blow these buffers. And it can happen very easily that we have, for instance, two reservoir bodies on top of each other, or it's a clay gorging fault between two segments. And from my experience, there is not really a very good concept which you can apply to predict what will happen. I think it is mainly, very skillful drilling and particular measuring pressures as much as you can. And then also, if you produce it, monitor the pressure with gauges downhole. I think this is a must. When you're in that setting, you must continuously follow what the downhole pressures are, because there you can see if you get a water breakthrough, or you even a baffle breaks and you get oil from another segment, everything is possible. But if it is about predicting, I would caution this. I think I couldn't do that. I wouldn't know how to do, really. I'm very frank with that.
Franz.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw Titus. Titus is in the group. So Titus, if you are there, maybe you have seen a lot more Fox example. So maybe you can help address the question a bit from your experience, Titus.
Hi, Titus.
That will be great to hear.
Maybe he's making a coffee.
Yeah, Titus seems to be around. He says, sure, he answered.
Sorry, I was just trying to find the unmute button. Have you got me now?
Yeah.
Look, I guess with the working out with the cutoff of the SGR, I don't know if people have seen the work that Silvia De Rosa did in Miri.
Yeah, I think Titus, that study was published last year, is it right? Last year or the year before?
Yeah, it was 2018.
Right, okay.
And there's some. We've also got some gigapan images up on the web where you can look at the variability on the lateral continuity of the fault rock. And what Sylvia found was that she went through meter by meter looking at the strike variability of the fault rock, and there's a massive variability on the fault rock. So if you look at one example and then you move 1 meter to the left or right, they're fairly similar. If you move 2 meters to the left or right, they become quite dissimilar. And when you get to 3 meters, they become very dissimilar. And so she's got a really nice little variogram in the paper there that shows that level of uncertainty. But the thing is that about every 5 meters, she found that there was an absence of fault rock, and that there was a wide variety between sand gouge and shale gouge. So what we've seen in outcrop is that these rock types are incredibly heterogeneous. And which where I'm coming from, the work we've been doing is I'm finding it harder and harder to come on a number that gives me an SGR cutoff. I think the stuff that, in particular, Franz, you talked about in there about the depositional environment is the key parameter. How thick is that top seal and how laterally continuous is it? And then when we juxtapose that top seal, what's happening? Is that what you were thinking about, John?
Well, yeah, I guess yeah, that's kind of help answering the question in raised. I guess you've seen a lot more, for example, than any one of us, I guess.
Yeah, and look, we've just found that the juxtaposition seems to be the key parameter. We've got a new paper that's coming out in the next 6-8 weeks where we've looked at some of the stuff in Norway, some of the old historic data from the Brent sequence, and we're seeing that same effect as well. We think that a lot of the stuff, there's a job for us as structural geologists, because the sand and shale is distributed because of growth faulting, and then it's a moot point. It's a point. How much of that sand and shale is a fault seal effect, or how much of it is a stratigraphic effect? And what we're thinking that's happened in Norway is that they are much more stratigraphic than fault seal.
Interesting. So, which journal are you publishing in?
That's going to be in the JOLSOC. That will be Petroleum Geoscience.
Okay, thank you. We're looking forward to that.
Yeah, maybe Titus, let me also say something about that.
Sure.
It is, of course, we have when we have faulted traps here, we have the clay gouging effect in the fault itself, the fault rock, and then all the material behind it. If on the other side of the fault you have a good shaly sequence, or let's say a sequence lean and sand, you are you not only have the sealing power of the gorge, but you have all the sealing power of the material behind. So that is the stratigraphic effect, which you also are referring to, I would say, right?
Yes, yeah, very much so. I think that these aren't perfect sheet sands. A lot of the cases there is stratigraphic variability, and the stratigraphic variability is a combination from sea level change, but also in relation to the delta geometry. And so as a structural geologist, we're coming in and helping understand the delta geometry as well, and where they sit, that delta geometry sits in the fault block.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt, but thank you, Titus, for the insight. Yeah, I think, but we should move to the next question. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, sorry, no worries.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Rizky Amanda. Yeah. So, Franz, is there any idea about the correlations of hydrocarbon column and the spill point? Are most of the fields filled to the spill or less than spill point?
So let me try to repeat the question. Is
any
it's
idea
about the spill point?
Any idea about the correlations of hydrocarbon column and the spill point? Are most of the fields filled to the spill or less than spill point?
Okay. The answer is that I think statistically, most fields are not really full to the maximum spill point. And particularly in these very young settings like Sabah also, everything is happening so fast there. I mean, the formation of the trap, and I mean, the sands in the trap are very young, and the oil migration is today or yesterday. And so there's, of course, the traps which are underfilled. I think one group is underfilled because of constraint of charge, but that doesn't seem to be the most obvious case. But I think the underfilling of other structures is miscellaneous effects, which can be in particular young movements along faults, or maybe even tectonic events like earthquakes and the like, which modify the structure in one sense or the other. And of course, it mostly when the accumulation is there at a given moment in time, it may have been full, but because of these other miscellaneous causes, then it actually did lose that charge, because a fault maybe differentially seals or differentially blows, or I mean, whatever reason there may be, or the topsoil is just a little bit permeable, and you lose over time the hydrocarbons, which are not refilled. And I think hydrocarbon migration is something which is an event which happens, according to my knowledge, in a very, very short time, because it's a chemical reaction which happens in the source rock, and it can be repeated. There can be pulses, yes, but the individual pulses which come from the source rock, I think, are very brief. It's not a friendly trickling over thousands of years. No, it's not. I think it's a massive wave, and then it fills, and then maybe there's another wave which comes back and fills again later, or there'll be no wave, and then you're either lucky and the system is very solid and very quiet and anything, so the column may be preserved down to the spill point, or you have over time effects that you leak a part of that accumulation away. That would be my answer to this.
Okay, thank you, Franz. Next question is from Pak Hendra. You can turn on your mic, please.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah. Okay, Franz, thank you for the presentation. I really love your work and publication that you published a couple of years back with Dr. John. So my question is actually related to deepwater Sabah. As you shown just now, we have quite a significant amount of hydrocarbon column, even close to 700 meters. Yeah, and actually, I personally, currently I'm working in deepwater Sabah, and when we check in terms of seal capacity, when we do the analysis on the leak-off test and fracture gradient, it seems that we still have quite significant amount of effective stress that can hold the hydrocarbon column even more than the one that we currently see. So I just want to know, based on your experience and your observation, what makes this top seal in deepwater Sabah become so prominent, so significant, that able to hold this amount of hydrocarbon? Is it related from a seal perspective? Is it related to since we are dealing with a deep water environment, so maybe a shale that is very, very pure shale, or maybe 100% clay contaminant, or maybe is it actually related to some the mineralogy within the clay itself? Maybe, I don't know, perhaps a different type of clay mineral can give us a better seal capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really an expert on this. Maybe John, he can also say something about that. But I mean, in first instance, would say, yeah, mineralogy is obviously important of the clay materials, but maybe equally important is that the long columns in that part of deepwater Sabah come from the fact that you have a combination of good seal and you have very high relief structures. And again, it's mostly water bearing. I mean, there's aquifer pressure. And the aquifer pressure is always benign. I mean, if you are halfway a decent seal, both fault seal and top seal and fault seal, both of them, if they're just kind of all right, you can very good columns, because the water drive is not that strong. But the moment you go into a gas prospect and you have a lot of overpressure, then it's a completely different scenario, I would say, yeah. And again, high overpressures in the oil we not see. I mean, it may exist, but I have never seen it really. So I think it has a lot to do with the drive mechanism and the pressures.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Any comment from John?
I think what Franz said was pretty much spot on. I think in deepwater Sabah you see a thick section of pelagic shale there, so there's a lot of potential seal up there. So the rule of thumb that we use for, well, at least deepwater Sabah area or northwest Borneo is, you know, if you have a top overburden of 700 meters, you could significantly start to hold some columns. So one of the first data point that we had is I think it's about 500 meters below mud line that hold like in the order of a couple hundred meters oil column in Sabah. The longest data point that was mentioned is from Kike, by the way, Kike 74, I think, is about almost 700 meters, 700 meters.
Yeah.
Yep, hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you. I think that is the last questions. So that will be end our discussions. So thank you very much for this very interesting presentations and also discussions, and also thank you for everyone that's still participating in these discussions. I will send to you all the material of these presentations, and the recording will be presented in our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, Franz and John, and also Titus for the insight. Yeah, thank you very much on behalf of FOSI, and stay safe. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will stop this.
Thank you very much.
End this meeting. Yeah. Okay.